Hi, everyone. My name is Laurie Forcier. I'm Chief Global Content Officer for LearnIt, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual event. Our mission at LearnIt is simple. We exist to support the meaningful conversations that education leaders want and need to have to make change happen. And we do this through our in-person event, which will next happen in London, January 19th through the 21st, 2021. And we do it like virtual events like the one we're having today. Now, today, we're talking about the new world of work, education, meaningful work, and the COVID-19 unemployment challenge. The ILO has warned that job losses are escalating across both the formal and informal labor sectors, and that half of the global workforce are at risk of losing their livelihoods. So in the face of such massive need, what are the opportunities now for training and for education? Will coherent systems of lifelong learning develop as we had hoped they might, or be viewed as a necessity, or will they be viewed as an impractical luxury at this point? We're honored to be joined today by education and talent leaders who are working to build education and training that will support a new, more meaningful world of work. We have Lisa Barrett, the Vice President for Learning and Delivery at WhiteHat, Nick Dalton, Executive Vice President, HR, Business Transformation for Unilever, David Miyashiro, the Superintendent of Cajon Valley Union School District, and Clayton Spencer, the President of Bates College. And we also have with us, joining us again, moderator Jenny Anderson, Senior Education Reporter. Now, a few notes on the format. We'll start with a moderated discussion for the first 45 minutes, then we'll turn to Q&A. The Q&A function will be open throughout, so feel free to submit your questions. We'll be selecting questions that resonate across the group and asking our panelists to address them at the end. With that, I'll turn things over to Jenny. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'm so excited for this conversation. Honestly, it's a really impressive group of people and coming at this topic, which is very important, from so many different angles. I go to Davos every year, which sounds super glamorous, but I'm just a hack chasing important people and trying to get them to talk to me. But it's amazing that year in, year out, there's this conversation about skilling and reskilling and upskilling. And I'm always sort of yelling, why aren't we talking about skilling well in the first place? Why isn't education a conversation that we're having in this forum with these people? Because it feels very relevant. I haven't gotten a particularly good answer as to why it's not on the agenda. But clearly that automation conversation is now exacerbated by the COVID unemployment question. And so today, the question we're asking is, how do we prepare students with the mindsets and skills and passions for work? How do we create real channels for students to learn to work and to get better at work? And when they're at work, how to continue learning? And we have great people here to talk about that. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the food chain, but that doesn't sound very good, at the bottom of the age food chain with David, who is the superintendent at Cajon Valley School District. And just to frame it very quickly, he spent the first 12 years, he was just telling me, turning schools around by improving their test scores, and very quickly realized that wasn't enough for students and families in the communities he was serving. And he built something called the World of Work curriculum, which is focused on making education relevant so that students will be engaged and can discover work that doesn't feel like work. The motto of his district is happy kids, healthy relationships, gainfully employed. David, what did you see that made you create this curriculum? What's in it? And what are the results? Briefly.
Actually, the World of Work started on the top floor of Qualcomm, which is a global technology company. Ed Hidalgo, our Chief Innovation Officer, had created this one-day experience for kids to come in from middle school to experience careers in mostly tech and STEM, but they would leave that experience having hope for their future that we'd never seen before. That matched with the 1.6 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, the underemployment in our country, and the gap between education and the workforce was all a perfect storm for us to invest. And our governing board, my bosses, invested $2.5 million to steal ed from private industry, to partner with the local University of San Diego, and create a curriculum that will teach children not just how to live, but how to make a living and to thrive in a world of work. And our system didn't have that prior to the development of this curriculum solution.
Oh my God, I can't believe we're this far into Zoom life and I still keep doing that. Apologies. Can you tell us just a tiny bit about the curriculum and what kind of results you're seeing from it? If employment, if gainfully employed is one of the pieces, is it working?
Yeah, so rather than just start with the world of work, it starts with helping students understand what their unique strengths, interests, and values are through career experiences. And so the president of Ohio State University, which organizes their college majors based on the RIASEC, which is an interest typology that is pervasive throughout our curriculum, he says, you can't rely solely on interest because kids can't know what they're interested in unless they've had life experiences. So starting in kindergarten, we expose kids to career experiences and force them to experience careers in all different typologies of interests, and then reflect with their teachers what felt like me, what didn't feel like me. And then in first grade, same thing. So by the time they get to 8th grade, they've experienced 54 to 70 career exposures on the global scale to really have an understanding of, what are my strengths, interests, and values, and where might I fit in the world of work?
So this segues so beautifully into Clayton's work that I have to go to her. I was going to go to Lisa next, but Clayton has been building something called Purposeful Work at Bates since 2013, which she defines, or broadly, work that has personal meaning and societal relevance. And it's integrated into every class that you take. There's special units on it. She's done a lot of work on creating networks to get relevant jobs. Clayton has this great quote that she borrowed from Sigmund Freud: if you get love and work right, you've sort of figured it out. But when I was first writing about it, what I loved and what I just heard from David is that she starts from the standpoint of work is important, but a lot of kids aren't going to know what work is meaningful to them. And it's a lot of pressure to ask a kid to figure that out. And so she's designing for helping them to figure that out. So Clayton, how is Purposeful Work going, and how is it changing right now? I think you might be muted.
It's all right. Purposeful Work is going great. And let me just back up 2 steps and say that Bates is a liberal arts college in Lewiston, Maine. And historically, liberal arts colleges have been very purist. They want to talk about curriculum and book learning. And so the idea that you're going to strengthen the link between the liberal arts, the critical thinking, creativity, connectivity, integrative thinking, ethical action that you learn in the liberal arts, those humanistic skills to the world of work, typically draws an antibody reaction at a small liberal arts college. But coming out of the last recession, since we're soon going to be talking about the current crisis, but coming out of the last recession, I'm like, this is nuts. We cannot be asking our students to invest 4 years of their lives in some of the most developmental years as they become adults moving out into the world, and not be figuring out what, again, we use exactly the same formulation: values, strengths, and interests, figuring out what they are, and having the exposure, again, because you don't know what you're interested in unless you're exposed. And that goes to subject matter, and it also goes to work opportunities. So we have very well structured internships. We have modules and courses that are tied to understanding how this biology course might link to work in a pharmaceutical industry or lab work or whatever. And those are pretty standard, but the most important dimension of purposeful work that it depends on the premise that human beings will live happy and effective lives, not if they go directly for happiness, but if they go for meaning and purpose. If they have meaning and purpose, their sense of fulfillment will be a byproduct of that. It's not like positive psychology and I just want to take a happiness course. So what we're trying to do is locate the agency for figuring out who you are, what you're good at, what you want to work at, and how you want to move through the world. Locate that agency in the individual, because we sure as heck know that that you're not going to walk into a company at age 22 when you graduate and get the gold watch 50 years later. Not happening anymore. So that's what I'll stop there for now.
All right. Well, I have a few things I definitely want to come back to. And honestly, I sort of just want to let David and Clayton speak to each other for a few minutes when we can. But Lisa, I would love to come to you. Now, WhiteHat is this sort of, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, genius connective tissue between employers who want to create apprenticeships, or the government's told them that they have to, and they're doing it, designing for the hard work of making it meaningful for the people doing it and making sure they get the skills that they need. So my understanding is you build it around content, skills of habit and mind, and coaching, work with employers like Google, Hearst, Expedia, Facebook, and you're focused on developing creative people with technical skills, which I really like that. What do you think the biggest challenge is to making apprenticeships work for both the employer and the apprentice, and how is WhiteHat sort of solving for that?
Great question and great description of WhiteHat. So that's exactly right. So WhiteHat is effectively an apprenticeship provider and training organization that works exactly like you said with companies and organizations to basically ensure that people have the right skills to perform on the job. And it's very much combining education and training. So, I mean, we've got a lot of people who think a lot about education on this call. If you think about what makes good learning, there's a question about, well, for what, to what end, or kind of what are you assessing for? And we think that, and have found that one of the best ways to get the right outcomes is to really put those things right together. So increasingly, the models of education that were developed that are about, okay, get front-loaded education and you're fine for the rest of your career. We know that's not the way that things work. People move around a lot. So really believe in being able to give people the right training at the right time and iterate on that, right? So I think that the idea of an apprenticeship you might think about people earlier in their career, and we do some of that. I think that's really important. So there was this really interesting study that was done in 2019, actually reported in Forbes, asking parents about kind of degree value. And they said that they actually thought that kind of working at Google was more prestigious than going to Harvard. But the question is, well, how do you do that? How do you get students to work at Google? And that pathway is just not open for a lot of people. So at WhiteHat, what we do is we work with employers to create a learning and training program, which means that we are able to identify people who will be very effective in jobs, and we know whether or not they were effective in a traditional education environment, because we know those things don't always correlate, and then bring them in and train them for critical jobs. And the benefit is they don't leave with a bunch of debt, which is true, for a lot of education setups, and they're able again to be very effective from the very beginning. So the results as well in terms of diversity are really incredible. So we have 49% Black and minority ethnic of the apprentices that we train, and 55% female, and more than a third come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's pretty incredible for what we're doing. And again, for working with employers like Google and Facebook and kind of at that caliber. But then it really needs to be ongoing learning. So an apprenticeship should be you need training for a specific role that you are doing, and that's going to continue for the rest of your life. So things are moving so quickly. One of the reasons we created WhiteHat was to be able to respond to that pace of change, so that we can quickly develop things. So as the world changes, as skills change, like we can implement that immediately. We don't have to go through lots of layers or bureaucracy or sign off to get stuff done. We can actually just implement things very quickly to make sure that we stay current and that people stay current, right? Because that's what everyone's worried about, is how do I stay current in my job?
I think you muted a bit at the very end, but I definitely want to come back on some of the logistics, because one of the things that I'm curious how you find the people that you're putting into your apprenticeships, and then how you are preparing for those skills. Is it just completely bespoke? Does Google tell you exactly what they need and then you prepare for that? Because I do know one of the interesting things is again, at Davos every year, they do these surveys, like what are the skills you need? And every year they completely flip, I mean, honestly, one year it's, the number one skill is cooperation. And then, a year later it's 12. You think either the survey is completely flawed or, we're not entirely sure where we stand with that particular skill. But let me go to Nick. And then again, I think we'll bring it all together so that way we'll have a sense kind of, and I hope the listeners are seeing how this is evolving, sort of K-12 to university to apprenticeships. And now Nick is, as Lori said, works at Unilever, but he's also written a book called Change the Workplace, Change the World, the HR Revolution. That's very clever. Sorry, I read it wrong. The HR Revolution. And one of the things he says in that book is that companies and organizations need to take a more systemic approach to employability, upskilling, reskilling. It can't be sort of organization by organization, everybody reinventing each other's work. We need to be doing this in more thoughtful ways and creating ecosystems, which is a word I totally hate, but I actually think is the best word that we need right now, but I'd love it if we could come up with a better one. And so I guess talk to us about that idea, what these ecosystems look like, and maybe just a little bit of the work that you're doing at Unilever right now that's addressing these questions that we're talking about, lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think if I speak frankly, we're facing into a situation, I think not only Unilever, but a lot of employers in the more traditional sectors. If we look forward 5 years, if we look at the impact of AI and machine learning, even before COVID, we were looking at many millions of jobs disappearing. These are jobs that basically the many do, not the few. The jobs that most people come out of education and do, not the elites who go and work at Google or learn how to be data scientists. People who work in factories, people who work in office jobs, using spreadsheets every day. These jobs are going to be automated. They're going to be decimated. And Unilever, our whole strategy is based on purpose. So we believe that brands with purpose actually have the right to grow. As a branded consumer goods manufacturer, actually you've got to have some form of technical superiority, but people emotionally attached to your product. And therefore, all of our brands need to have a social or environmental mission to be in our stable. Now, on the one hand, we say that and we invest a lot of money in that. But if on the other hand, whilst we're doing that, we're making thousands and thousands and thousands of people unemployed every year. As Scott Galloway, the professor at New York Stern says, it's your virtue signaling an hypocrisy sandwich, and we don't want to do that. So we want to face straight into that paradox. Now, in facing into that paradox, what we know is this, that we can't protect jobs, but what we can do is do everything we can to protect livelihoods. Now, in protecting livelihoods, there's 3 or 4 things we have to start doing and have to start doing differently. We can no longer manage change by saying we'll look after you, which was the way we managed change 100 years ago. We can't manage change by saying we'll just do what we want as long as it's legal, because that's not who we are. We can't manage change by just running some processes and obeying the law and doing works council type stuff, because it takes too long to manage to change that way. And we can't manage change by pretending to be transformational leaders and say, I'll convince you it's a good idea for you to lose your job. That don't work either. The only way now to face into this change is, 1, to work with employees and their representatives, not to them, not do change to them, not change manage people, but change with them, to make sure that every single one of our employees understands that they have a right to realize their purpose in life and realize their potential as part of our employment contract. And that we put 55,000 of our 100,000 plus workforce through purpose workshops. When we did it 3 years ago, we didn't know why we were doing it, to be honest. Now we know why, because it gives us a platform now for each one of them to agree with us what their upskilling, reskilling, or employability plan is for the future. And by putting that in place now, we can prepare all of ourselves for what the future brings us. Because actually we're preparing ourselves for change way before change happens. We're not just making an announcement and then saying to people, you've got 3 months after which you're on your own, here's some outplacement and off you go. We're actually pumping it into our system as a right. The issue we face, Jenny, which is why I'm really pleased to be on this call, is if every company took that view, which they don't, by the way, but for every company that did take that view, we still wouldn't succeed, because the solutions we've got to solve are systemic. We've got to do this in alliances. Companies shouldn't just be outplacing, we need to be creating roles and creating ecosystems, if I can call it that, so that people have something to go to, and companies have to do that together with the education sector and with governments. And at the moment, in all honesty, we all work in our own silos maximizing the benefits in our own silos, and we're creating a tragedy in the commons because we're not working together in a proper way.
That's so interesting, because I think what you're talking about is sort of companies working together. And what's so interesting is, like, everybody on this call, there's like some interesting kind of how could all levels of the system be working together more coherently. That's probably overly ambitious. Again, I feel like after each one of you stops, I have a million questions for each of you. I feel like if I got called into one of your purpose workshops, I would be terrified that I was being laid off, because it sounds like it's potentially preparing you for that. But I don't think that that's actually what you meant. But maybe we should just assume that we're all perpetually being prepared for unemployment. I want to ask a question about, and I hope you all sort of push back on me for asking the question, but I think it's a question that's often in the public dialogue, which is, whose responsibility is it to make sure that students have the skills to succeed in work? Is that David's? Is it Clayton's? I mean, the easy answer here is everyone, but kind of reflect on that in this moment, if you could. And I'm going to let whoever wants to jump on that one first go. Lisa?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a really critical thing about the employer. And what do I mean by that? Well, we believe, and what we've seen is that the place where more and more education is happening is on the job. That has to be true, because as has been mentioned already, you're living longer and things are changing rapidly. So I think that in some ways, the employer is just absolutely at the center of things. So does training work? Does education work? Well, again, you find out when you're employed. But I think really good training and education actually, it allows the individual to take more responsibility as well, if that makes sense. So we all know that there are skills that you have to have, and then there are mindsets, skill sets, and behaviors, that are more general. So, for example, in the work that we do at WhiteHat, we are not just training you to be a software engineer. We're not just training you to be a data scientist. We're also training you the way that you should interact with your manager. How to manage up, how to manage yourself. What is interpretation, versus actual fact in situations, right? So there are a lot of things that hold people back from being successful and living great lives that are not just those skills, but actually how do you perceive yourself and perceive reality. And by the way, it's even stronger, obviously, if you come from a disadvantaged background, right? You're gonna have more baggage, you're gonna have more story, you're gonna have had more experiences, and you're gonna need more tools in some ways to overcome that stuff. So I started my career teaching the most disadvantaged students in the US in Oakland, California, or some of them, I should say. So I think the point being that I think that we can't ignore the role of the employer, which I think is just absolutely critical. And if we're doing the training right, we're then giving the employee the opportunity to, again, take responsibility, understand where they're going to be most successful and a good fit. More and more companies are doing exactly what Nick is talking about, which is saying, actually asking people, like, what are you motivated by? What's your passion? Because when you can get those things right, you actually get better returns from people. And it may not be a perfect one-to-one, but the more you can align company purpose with individual purpose, you're going to get better outcomes. So I think, that's what we see as critical. And again, that identity piece, just to say one more thing is, when we're thinking about what we do at WhiteHat, we're not just also, again, putting people into a program, but we're saying you're now part of an organization, a community where you can now network and get the resources you need. So all of us will know from our experience, life also is about networking, who you know, the relationships you have, right? So part of what we're doing is creating that important community and network and access and ability to see yourself as much bigger and beyond the role you have. Because again, we can train people just to do a skill, but if we're going to get where we need to go and with all the problems we need to solve in the world, we need people thinking, much bigger, and we need different people at the top who are having those conversations.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Yeah, Clayton, I would love for the educators here to weigh in on this kind of skills versus mindsets versus content versus, it's a very, probably overly necessary and overly polemic debate, but it exists. So tell me how you guys think about this question.
So one of the things I think we're seeing in the COVID world is a blurring of personal versus professional, family versus professional. We're also seeing a blurring of work and learning. And I think that's great. I think it's very creative space. And I think it is incumbent on educators to make people, to open people's minds. And this is the part of the program of Purposeful Work at Bates, was planting a flag and saying, if human beings are about finding fulfillment through meaning and purpose, work is absolutely central to that. And I remember as my kids were growing up talking about the blurring of the lines, I'd be like, Will, school is your day job. Now I want you to take it seriously and do it. And so I think for education, not only is it important, but it's incredibly effective, as David's examples make clear. If students know what their learning relates to and actually approach their learning as important work, so it becomes seamless. And that's the only way you are going to get that searching for purpose. I mean, your employees may not have ever been asked what their personal purposes are, and they have to understand the concept. Once you understand that that's a legitimate question and you're inculcating that in education, then you can start figuring out what are the external experiences that will give you the exposure to figure it out.
I love this conversation. I could listen to everybody all day long. When we see the statistics in our country about underemployment, unemployment, disengagement, employee disengagement, 1.6 trillion in student loan debt, which equates to a lot of kids start college and don't finish, and a lot of kids go to college and finish and don't find a career in their field. And we raised our hand and said, that's our fault. So in answer to your question, Jenny, it's on all of us. But I think K-12 in particular, because in the US, our system was designed in 1892, and it's been the same ever since. 8 years of primary school, 4 years of high school, content area hasn't changed. And so we look at the Gallup student engagement poll, which we use across all 50 states here. And it shows that students hope for their future, their engagement in school, their career financial literacy, and their entrepreneurial skills peak at 5th grade and then bottom out at around 30% by the time they finish high school. And if we don't get to the students earlier and give them the knowledge, skills, and dispositions and hope for their future, then a lot of them aren't even finishing high school, are just finishing to complete because it's a rite of passage to something else. And in California, we measure success in our schools by this dashboard that measures test scores at fixed point in time, starting in 3rd grade, and then high school exit. So if you look at just how we're measured, the purpose of the school system is to get kids out.
Right.
And that's not enough. That's a basement level type of archetype. And that's why I'm so excited about this conversation, because I think that if Clayton, Nick, and Lisa and I were all serving the same community, we would have like a utopian society, right? I mean, every child would find their meaning and fulfillment, a complete employed ecosystem of people, and people happy and engaged in their work. So exciting.
David, can I just quickly ask you to reflect on parents' reaction to this? Because I'm curious, I feel like there's sometimes a disconnect about, most parents will say they want their kids to be happy and they don't think education's all about the tests, but then you try to change the tests and they sometimes get a little uncomfortable. And so I'm curious whether you've gotten buy-in for these sort of relationships, employability. I mean, it sounds wonderful. I'm just curious what the external support for it has been, or resistance, if you've had that.
Thank you. We have a very diverse community. So we have about 50 to 60% of our students that are around the poverty level. But we have also a very affluent community too in our community, where small business owners and really thriving professionals in biotech, health, and sciences. So we have a gambit, and our 2-generation strategy about helping parents help themselves also. So our career development is not just for the kids, but for the parents also in our curriculum. Most parents say, I wish I had this when I was a kid. And I'm so glad that my child's starting to think about their future now. I also have parents that say, no, my child's going to Columbia and he's going to be an engineer, period. And I don't argue with parents, because if that's your goal for your child, great. But if you're going to spend $60,000 on your child's education, don't you want 100% return on your investment? Then they're interested in leaning, well, what do you mean? And then we share the data and statistics. Well, 1.6 trillion student loan debt, this many people complete. What are your child's natural interests, strengths, and values, and what other careers might they actually thrive in? And then we can get most people into the conversation. But for those parents who are absolutely adamant, this is my child's future, then we don't mess with their, their plan for their children.
Sensible. Very, very useful way of looking at time, right? Nick, do you want to pop in on any of this? Where do you see the responsibilities being? Are you with Lisa and again, I think we all agree it's sort of everybody's, and we want in our utopian world where, we're creating these highly employable, happy, well-adjusted, excellent relationship children. It's all of us, but where do you think about that question?
I think that's the issue. You see, the issue today, given today's issues, it's systemic. It has to be everybody, and that's the insight. Because I think that's a change from the past. In the past, in the system we had, and David mentioned to it, the schools had a particular, and the universities had a particular responsibility, and then the employers had a particular responsibility, and then everyone retired with a pension, and that's gone because of length of life and because of the impact of technology. So unless we approach this systemically, and to David's point, it probably does take people to come together in their communities and start to work together. We all fail. And I think this issue, we need both. We need both the transactional piece, which is teaching people skills, teaching people to do the tests and the exams. I think you still need that. People need to be credentialed. You need to know about something you're doing. But it's an and, because we also need the purpose. Because without that grounding in purpose, people can't reinvent themselves every 4 or 5 years. And that's what they're going to have to do in the future.
And that purpose, and what I'm hearing from others, purpose with experience. Like you figure out your purpose by doing stuff, getting out there, lots of exposure. I actually interviewed someone from the Purposeful Work program, and it just reminded me so much of my own. She had no idea what she wanted to do. She thought she had an idea. She did an internship. She realized that wasn't the thing. And, she did another internship and she realized that was closer. It was like she was getting there, and so by the time she left college, she was closer. Clearly, most of us are still figuring it out now. So, I think there's a lot to that. I definitely want to get to COVID because obviously that's very much on people's minds. How is what is happening in the world right now, a global pandemic? Obviously, we've spoken about the unemployment piece of it, and I think that's maybe the obvious piece, but I'm curious if this moment is catalyzing your work. Is it showing how much more important it is? Is it going to stymie your work? Can anyone jump in and kind of give us a sense as to how you're thinking about that? Don't make me call on you.
Okay, I'll start. So immediately we closed our schools on March 13th, and in California that meant shelter in place for every person, except for essential workers. And so a large number of our society continued to report to work physically. And that started with healthcare, hospital, emergency responders, police, and those protecting the critical infrastructure, teachers and school employees, and there was a hierarchy produced by our government to show who the essential workers are and who needs to report, all the way down to our grocery stores and food supply. And the conversation about whose work is essential is a fascinating topic that is still relevant for our community now as we start going back to open our economy. But Clayton's concept about value, strengths, and interest, values is really where you think about essential. And in COVID, I think the concept of all work has value and there's dignity in all work couldn't be more true right now. And to start thinking about conversations about when I start my career, does a pension matter to me? Is that still a viable option? Do I have a retirement? Do I have job security in the case of an economic downturn or a pandemic? And there's a greater degree of depth of conversation around meaningful and sustainable work here in our community.
I think Clayton's unmuting herself. Yeah?
Poor job, doing a poor job of it, sorry. I would say, echo that about essential work and I think the feeling of certain people on the sort of front lines of essential work, of keeping businesses open with a lot more human interaction and therefore exposure, who find themselves flipped rhetorically from being completely dispensable workers to essential workers. And I would like to build on that point by saying, I think COVID is also, in the case of the Purposeful Work program, which we built after the last recession, I think it has radicalized the case for purposeful work. because you already saw we've already seen over the last couple decades, but the last 10 years in particular, the ways corporations are structured to get work out of people was hierarchy, controlling information, and then controlling space and time. And over the last 10 years, we've already seen hierarchy and the control of information get completely downgraded as a way of getting the work you need out of a workforce. And we've just seen space and time go. I mean, maybe you can on Zoom. So you have what is really a dematerialized workplace. So to me, a program that is built on navigating this world that's complex, fast changing, and no longer takes an individual and plugs them into a culture in a straightforward way, just puts the premium on self-awareness, agency, integrating what you want to do. And the final thing I would say is, I think COVID has been a moment of real creativity in the workplace, because we have taken, I mean, we closed down on March 13th too, David, since I seem to follow most of the things you do, but we closed down on the 13th, and certain people were more needed than others. And we just reassigned people to work on the planning for bringing our students back in the fall. So they've met new people, they've done new functions, gotten out of their internal silos, and found huge both interpersonal gratification and purpose in doing that.
Thanks, Clayton. That was really interesting. I am hearing a lot about I think certainly as a parent, one of the things I saw is, and I've heard this from a lot of people that I've been interviewing, is that certainly parents are seeing the qualities that allow you to succeed in lockdown. So you might be genius at math, but if you can't focus, if the teacher's not hovering over you, that's a problem. So for all the talk of soft skills, suddenly it's a very hard skill. And maybe there will be more appreciation for that, having seen how important it is. And so when we talk about math and science, those are very important topics. But as we talk about, you know, some of the attributes we need to succeed, it just became very apparent, right? And in very close quarters. So Lisa, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a couple of perspectives. So, I mean, one is, I think it's really interesting how in a crisis, there can be an opportunity to do things that were just considered weird or uncomfortable before. So some of it does go to control, but there's also just a thing about our feeling of what works. So, you know, lots of organizations haven't gone as digital as they would want to because they just were skeptical that people would actually work from home and wouldn't, you know, do whatever, or that learning can work in a remote way. And so we turned our entire operation from 100% face-to-face in person to 100% face-to-face remote in 9 days. And actually our outcomes in terms of learning outcomes have remained the same. We've had to be creative, of course, about how to build those human connections, but I think there's a lot that people are willing to do that they wouldn't have done before. And then because what we're seeing, we've been forced into a situation of being more creative and having more distance learning, then we're able to have these conversations called, well, what does good education look like? I think the other thing to say is just that there's an impact obviously on the jobs market as well, in the sense that I'm just looking at these statistics that digital 66% of companies that were interviewed in a survey that we looked at said that this had exposed weaknesses in their digital strategy. So it meant that people who were putting forward digital transformation programs that would normally take something like a year to be approved were getting them signed off in a matter of weeks, right? So the expectations of people that we knew were coming anyway about being able to do things quickly, digital, you know, have the data in front of you, not have to go gather it from, you know, all the people on the third floor, that type of thing. You know, those expectations became now. So that we have actually seen an increase in demand for data science, data visualization, software engineering. So while the market is adjusting, actually certain skills are just rocketing right up, and we've accelerated and pulled that forward. And I don't think it's a bad thing. One of the reasons I'm a big fan of education technology, not in and of itself, like I'd never want to have a world where everything is 100%, asynchronous online, but as you get the data. So in lots of ways, what we're getting in this situation is an ability to have a conversation and say, well, again, like what actually works? Like what do the data say about individuals working or individuals learning, instead of opinions, oh, that won't work, or, if we move people online, we'll get a worse experience. So I think it's really interesting.
Thanks a lot for that. Nick, I'd love to just, we've got a lot of questions coming in and I'll definitely turn to those, but you talked about creating these sort of purpose workshops and sort of preparing for this moment, and it's going to be that moment. We're in that moment, right? So now you're reskilling and upskilling and trying to, if the objective was to prepare people for, a pretty potentially bad outcome, we're sort of at that outcome. Do you feel like it's working? Like, is the work materializing in this moment for what you need it to? Are these people who have gone through this transformation learning and able, you think, to kind of go forward with that?
No, not yet, because COVID has accelerated the trends that we were preparing ourselves for.
Right, happened too fast.
Yeah, and therefore, no, we're not ready. And we face into this paradox, because our key workers in Unilever were the people who went and kept our food factories running and our hygiene factories running, and the people in our value chain who distributed for us, and the salespeople who still had to go to the shops that were still open, putting themselves at risk. And these are the people whose jobs are likely to be automated out over the next 5 to 10 years. If you look in society as a whole, and apologies for the UK perspective, but the jobs that are growing, the jobs that we really need now, are in the care sector and in the health sector. And these are the people we put in precarious contracts and don't pay properly. And therefore, what you can see here is potentially a systemic solution, which is where we have lots of need to care for people. We have lots of jobs and things that need to be done, but we're not going to be able to transition people from the old to the new unless we actually start to work together in very different ways. If the education sector is going to be impacted at higher and further education level because of kids not wanting now to attend campus, well, actually, there's a big role we can play in helping to reskill and upskill and build employability programs for the people who are our key workers today in things like the food industry and the distribution industry, who will need reskilling. And maybe we should start to think about those sorts of solutions together. And as I said before, it's going to need companies to come together, education to come together, local government to come together, trade unions to come together, to start working these solutions urgently, because they're not top down. They're not going to come from the government. They're only going to come from people working together now, bottom up, and creating the solutions themselves. And it is urgent, Jenny. It's why I like to come to these calls, because there is an urgent rallying cry now. We haven't got 10 years. We haven't got 5 years. We've literally got 5 months, 6 months. The economic tsunami that's potentially about to hit us will mean that the social consequences could be huge if everyone acts in their own silo.
Yeah, huge opportunity. Actually, you just said something that's very powerful. Amazing that this entire conversation, the role of government, has not really even come up, right? So this is very much to that question of responsibility and action. It's coming up potentially in the vacuum of leadership that we might be seeing around the world. I want to ask a couple of these questions because people have good ones. So we hear that so many of the current jobs in existence will now not exist in 10 or 20 years' time. How do you future-proof work-related exposure? I feel like that is a lot of what we've been talking about, but that's a wonderfully direct question. So who would love to take a stab at that one?
I'll start. So people ask, how do you prepare kids for jobs that you don't know if they don't know exist? And how do you prepare kids for jobs of the future that aren't even yet there for them, especially if you're starting in kindergarten? And we go back to strengths, interests, and values. Who are you? What do you like to do? And where might you like to do it? So that as jobs change and as jobs get automated and new jobs are created, if you have that compass of who you are, what you like to do, what you're good at, and the purpose that Nick talks about, then you'll be able to continue on your path. as opposed to being stuck and all of a sudden out of work and without a compass. So I think starting with the person and creating an opportunity for the kids to develop a skill set and a repertoire of their own personal journey.
Jenny, you mentioned government and its absence, and I think there are whole big categories of work that aren't going to be automated, that are deeply human work, which is figuring out how to be an ethical actor in the world, figuring out how to bring back into focus the public good. Nick mentioned the tragedy of the commons, and I don't even think we could find the commons right now. There's a whole kind of education work that is never going to be automated. And I don't mean to underestimate the actual jobs that will be lost. But I remember as a young kid telling my parents that I was concerned that all the world's problems would be solved by the time I grew up. And it weighed on me. And I'm just suggesting that I don't think we're anywhere close to solving all the world's problems. And if we can't figure out a way to bring people back into concepts that are substantive and material of equity and justice and purpose and how you treat the planet and how you treat other species, how you treat your fellow human beings, there is a lot of work there to be done. And so I feel like we can be working a good long time on the specifically value add that I think humans with humanistic values are going to be required to bring to the table. And if we don't bring them to the table pretty soon, I'm really concerned about our institutions of government, the concept that the market is somehow going to magically distribute resources in a fair and equitable way, etc.
If I can just come in, I think, well, definitely if I ever move back to the US, David, I'm going to live in your school district and send my kids to your schools. But I think I was just going to say, I think that there's a real conversation that we haven't had time to have that does need to be led by government, but really needs to be everyone, which is called, what kind of society do we want to create? What kind of world do we want to live in? And I think that there's just been so much distraction in the last few years for lots of different reasons, but it's a real missing. Like, where are we going? What do roles look like? And I'm not saying those things aren't happening, but I just came out of 3 years of being a British civil servant. So I can say that there are a lot of distractions, and the ability to focus on that and then line things up to that, are pretty difficult. And I will say, kind of in that role, I spent the last 3 years trying to work at the boundary of government to form public-private partnerships and collaborations. And what I found is that civil servants, people working in government, have amazing networks in government, and people working in the private sector have amazing networks there. And the overlap is almost none. So saying things like, well, why don't we get someone from Google to come in and help us think about how we make policy? The response would be, well, why would they want to do that? Well, of course they would. I mean, that's an interesting conversation. Or lots of other things. So the only way we actually are going to solve this is by having more cross-pollination and by having those conversations together. And that's really difficult because we actually don't work together. We do work in silos.
Jenny, maybe I can just jump in as well with the very specifics of the question, because often we find that companies turn around and say the education system doesn't educate the kids for what we need. And then the education system says, yeah, but you don't tell us what you need. And the two things just go like this. And of course, we in companies can't tell anyone what we need because we don't know. Anyone who says they know is probably, being a bit heroic. And in the education sector, you won't know either. And I've been thinking about this in the context of history, because every era has something great you've got to take to the next era and build on it, not throw it away. And there was an era where people learnt their jobs on the job. They didn't really go to school that much. They left school at 14 and learnt it on the job. That was right for that era. And there's something in that we've got to retain. Then there was an era where people got professionalized and got qualifications and went through specific, things they needed to learn about. Well, that was good too. And we need to retain about that. I wish I knew more, could do calculus and things, that this is stuff you need, basic stuff. And now we're in an era where we're adding the purpose piece to these building blocks. And it's a matter of adding on what we've got. It's not a matter of saying there's a new magic thing now, and you can change your curriculums because they no longer matter. There's this magic. That's not true. It's actually integrating something else into what exists. It's as simple and as difficult for me as that. And we shouldn't chase the unicorn of these magic solutions that we're all going to be able to suddenly identify the right curricula and the right skills. And actually, it's going to map perfectly for the future. But the purpose agenda, the people-centered approach, building on the previous approaches we've had in history, I think is part of the answer.
I think that's really interesting. And I wonder if maybe our sort of hyper-focus on productivity and optimization has really led us deep into these silos, which has us all putting our heads down and, as Lisa says, not looking across, which we did used to do a little bit better, I think. I want to get to one more question, which is what I think we have time for. Oh, she just changed it. Okay. Can Nick talk about what a new ecosystem might look like? How do companies create this?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't know, so I'm speculating, but I think it's probably going to happen fast. One of the things that we saw after 9/11, when the first crisis the aviation industry had, one of their solutions was to create alliances. The Star Alliance, the One World Alliance, where they started to share routes, they started to share back offices, and they started to work together in terms of a lot of the sort of transactional admin tasks. I think that concept will now grow. I think we will see companies sharing employees. I think we will see companies sharing back office functions way beyond transactional stuff, but going into some of the professional functional areas. I think companies will share HR people. I think the great opportunity is for those alliances to also encompass educational institutions and trade unions and governmental institutions, and really create networks and alliances that can work to a common purpose that actually goes beyond the needs of each individual. As business, we've got to stop outplacing people. We've got to start creating an ecosystem that people can go into when our circumstances change, which they will. So I think the Star Alliance concept, if I can use Star Alliance, I was in Switzerland, I used to travel Swiss Air, that was Star Alliance, that's why it's the one that comes to my mind. That concept, I think, has real possibilities for us moving forward.
I love your example in light of the fact that all of the airlines are teetering on bankruptcy, but it is very powerful. I don't think I quite grasped how radical an idea you were talking about. So that was a really helpful answer. Thank you. Here's another question, and I would love to dive into this one for like 2 hours, and we have 5 minutes. Do you think that education will dramatically be affected by post-COVID-19 as it embraces the digital world in this moment? So do we see a transformation of education as well?
I've used this with parent groups. Technology has transformed every industry except education until now, right? So our kids who get a computer in kindergarten, we give them a new one in 3rd grade, then we give them a new computer in middle school that they keep. They never turn it in. Our kids' digital skills, when we had to move to distance learning and parents had to, take on this role of supervising to some degree, our kids didn't have login issues. Our kids could access all their content. Even our kindergarten students didn't have any access issues to their technology. And watching what was happening in all the other school districts that didn't have these devices and skills in place before COVID, it had a really hard time and started throwing computers out the window without any infrastructure, data privacy, data security, and all the things that it takes to run a robust technology program in K-12. I think it's going to radically change things for lots of people. For us, it's just the way we've been doing business. Like Lisa talked about at WhiteHat, they were positioned to do remote learning before this happened. And so I think that it's a huge disruption, and that for school districts trying to go back to as it was are going to have a really hard time navigating their future. as they compete with private schools and charter schools, who will pivot and will be ahead of the curve.
David, I think both Lisa and I are moving to your school district in like the next 17 seconds. Clayton, let me put that question to you, but let me add a little bit, which is coming off of another question, which is, does the cost of education come down? So since that's very relevant to sort of where you sit, reflect on the first question as well, if you'd like, but also I think this cost question is very top of mind for everyone. We've talked about this $1.6 trillion worth of debt. It's profound.
Yes. So I think the cost of education will come down. It was going to come down before COVID. I think, again, it's accelerated that. The crisis has accelerated the importance of that. I will say that, I mean, you already see degrees being much more accessible at a much more accessible price through broad online learning. Even a small residential liberal arts college, which is all about in-person everything and the kinds of relationships you form there. I think technology will change the way we do business in all sorts of good ways and let you optimize the discussion intensive applied aspects of courses and not I mean, we've already moved away from the sage on the stage, standing up and lecturing, but I think having everybody all of the sudden have to become comfortable with many more modalities of basically creating and packaging their information for students, it's going to allow people to really optimize those things that the in-person experience allows. And certainly for American parents, the collegiate model that they want to outsource their children from 18 to 22 and have that last piece of development happen, please, not in their own house anymore after the teenage years. I think there will still be value in the holistic education that you get in person, but it's not going to be the same. And I think that's largely a good thing.
I think I'd like to start that outsourcing process sooner, but I'm not going to get into that. Nick, just very quickly, there's a question on here about, are you as comfortable hiring someone from an open university with excellent skills versus Oxbridge or Ivy League or mini Ivy League? I mean, do you care?
Yeah, in Unilever, we actually take on more apprentices than we do graduate trainees every year in most of our countries. And moving forward, we actually, apprentices are probably, if you look at it from a business perspective, you get better return on investment. So it's not an either or, you need both, but certainly apprentices are a brilliant source of talent.
Like music to Lisa's ears. So quickly, Clayton, I got a question here. What is happening to this year's graduating class at Bates? I think they mean in the context of employment. How do their job prospects look right now?
I think they're doing well. I think we'll know more 6 months and 12 months out. We took our whole internship program from Purposeful Work and reversed it and made it virtual. And we have almost exactly the same number of internships. So I think it's a time, I think our graduates are entering an incredibly tough job market. And we will be working with them very intensively. But we just haven't been out of, they just graduated in May. We haven't had enough experience to know exactly where that's going to land.
Right. All right. Before I turn it over to Lori, I just want to wrap up very quickly. A few thoughts I had from each of you. Starting with the person is what I took from David. Start with the person, let the person figure out who they are, what they need, passion and purpose, and give them some skills around that. I love this concept from Clayton about deeply human work, equity, justice, purpose, planet. Plenty of problems to solve for. Unfortunately, your childhood wish of, or fear that all the world's problems would be solved did not actually materialize. So there is still so much to do. Lisa's talking a lot about cross-pollination and solving for it. I think that's a lot of the work that you're doing and how important that is. Something that Nick was talking about as well. And this power of alliances. I love this kind of idea of sort of, you know, the HR person in two different companies. That's very, it feels like science fiction to me, but, you know, probably so does a lot of other things about what's actually happening in the world right now. So thank you to all of you. I've learned so much in this conversation and really enjoyed it. And I wish we could keep talking for like 5 more hours, but over to you, Lori.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you, Lisa, Nick, Clayton, and David. I knew it was going to be a great discussion, and it certainly hasn't disappointed in any way, shape, or form. Thanks to our audience for submitting some fabulous questions. The recording of this session will be available, and we'll follow up with a summary of the major points from today, as we always do. Next week, we're going to be talking about what does successful virtual learning look like and how will it change schools. So you can find out more information about that at learnit.world. If you haven't done so already, invite you to join our mailing list so that you can keep on top of what we're doing, and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And with that, take care, please keep well, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.